If you asked most analysts in March of 2022 what the war in Ukraine would look like in June of 2023, I imagine most wouldn't have opened with rebellious mercenaries seizing the city of Rostov-on-Don and launching a column towards Moscow. To be fair, mutinies and coups are not exactly new as a concept, having probably existed ever since the first soldier realised that they were the one with the rock or the pointy stick, and that as a result maybe they didn't have to take orders from other people. And to be fair, tensions between Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner Group and the Russian Ministry of Defense have been visibly growing for some time. Less than a month ago, for example, we saw reports that the Wagner Group took prisoner and interrogated a colonel of the Russian ground forces, which is pretty remarkable given the forces are meant to be on the same side and usually allied forces don't take each other prisoner. But even that probably didn't prepare us for the sight of Wagner troops strapping their armoured vehicles to transporters and making a thunder run towards the Russian capital, with the mercenaries shooting down multiple Russian attack helicopters as they launched their lightning thrust towards Moscow. Over the course of less than 24 hours, we were treated to some incredible sights. We got to see a former criminal turned caterer turned mercenary unit leader occupying the headquarters of the Russian Southern Military District. We got to see municipal authorities trying to block the highways towards Moscow using dump trucks. While you could argue that Rostov-on-Don became the largest city occupied by Russian forces since their invasion of Ukraine. For internet commentators, it seemed like nothing could stop Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner mercenaries. And then, seemingly just like that, it was over. A deal was reached, the Wagner troops racing towards Moscow turned around, while Wagner troops in Rostov-on-Don took selfies with onlookers before heading back to their field camps. It was an abrupt turn of events that must have left many observers asking the same basic questions. What on earth had just happened, and what did it all mean? Today I'm going to try and address that question as best I can given the information we have available. To do that, I'm going to start by giving a little bit of coup and mutiny 101. What are they, how common are they, and what are the features of those that are generally successful? Then I'll pivot to looking at the Wagner Mutiny itself. I'll ask what its prospects of success were if Prigozhin had chosen not to take a deal and just kept going. I'll look at some of the conspiracy theories around the turn of events. But most importantly, I'll try and pull out some key observations from that day and the events that have followed. And perhaps most importantly, look at some of the big picture impacts and what this might all mean for Russia and its war in Ukraine going forward. But before I jump into it, a quick word from a sponsor. And today I once again welcome back my VPN of choice and a returning sponsor, Private Internet Access. Now I think it's fair to assume that Prigozhin didn't plan the Wagner Mutiny using unsecured airport Wi-Fi. Although some of the group's past experiences do make it clear that you should probably be careful about what information makes it online. That can be pretty hard when even a casual Google search will reveal plenty of cases of major data breaches. Social networks, government organisations, network operators. There are recent cases of all of them being breached and customer privacy being breached with it. Now, unless you happen to be Mark Zuckerberg or a cybersecurity agency, there's probably not too much you can do about that. But you can adopt a collection of tools and practices designed to help protect your privacy online. And one of those tools can be a VPN. Using a VPN, just 1 or 2 clicks can help conceal your IP address, reroute your internet traffic, and help protect your privacy, especially on public networks. And when it comes to issues like data breaches, Private Internet Access has a particular advantage, because they advertise an independently audited no-logs policy. And even the best hacker out there is going to struggle to steal data that doesn't exist. This probably won't save you if you insist on responding to every spam email with your full name, address, date of birth, and credit card information, but it may help shift the needle on your online privacy. The service also allows you to connect to VPN servers in 84 countries worldwide, and a subscription allows you to protect an unlimited number of individual devices, all while being available across multiple platforms and being compatible with a range of streaming services. And so if you're interested, please check out the link in the description below. It'll give you 83% off a 2-year subscription, plus 4 bonus months, all protected, of course, by a 30-day money-back guarantee. Okay, so one quick point before we get into it. At time of recording, all this stuff only happened within the last week. And because of how dramatic it was, as you can imagine, there's an awful lot of rumour-mongering surrounding it. Plus, a lot of the information we have about it comes from the Russian and Belarusian governments, who may have some incentives to provide a distorted view of reality. So in this video, I'm going to try and avoid as much of the rumour-mongering as possible. I'm not going to engage with questions of who is or isn't in prison, who is or isn't being investigated, who knew what when, or what their objectives might have been. Instead, I'm going to focus on what we think we know about what happened and what we can deduce from there. As for a lot of the stuff that's still speculation, well, we'll wait for time to tell. Okay, so for those of you who've ever had at least a passing thought of overthrowing a government, wake up because this part's for you. We're going to talk quickly about Coups 101. Coups and mutinies are ancient phenomenon because they represent an almost intrinsic threat of organised state structures. This is because of the way power fundamentally works in most organised states. Most will have legal structures that determine how power is divided up between organisations or individuals. Maybe, for example, you have a parliament or a congress responsible for making law, but an executive responsible for running and administering the country. However, for laws to mean much, it has to be possible to enforce them. And usually the people enforcing those laws are not going to be the same people who made them. Break the law in the US and you're not going to see Joe Biden and congressional leadership strapping on tactical gear and serving a warrant. So states will usually create forces to enforce law and to protect borders. If Dave's been spending too much time on the forums, for example, and now doesn't believe he needs a driver's license to do 200 k's an hour on the freeway, well, there's probably going to be some cops who can pull Dave aside, respectfully disagree with his legal position, and ensure the law is followed whether he agrees with it or not. If a foreign power decides some of your land is in fact their land, well, your military can communicate your dispute of their claim in the universal language of high explosive. The key here is that most states will have organisations intended to deploy force at home or abroad, and that one of the commonly cited hallmarks of an independent nation state is to have a monopoly on the legal use of force within its territory. The problems, however, arise when those organisations decide to use force not for the system, but instead against it. At that point, we're getting into the territory of coups and mutinies. Now, you could argue that the word coup has become somewhat overused. Often it seems to be used in a sense of any effort to change the politics of a country in a way that you personally don't agree with. In that sense, coup can mean almost anything. One person's grassroots-powered revolution can be another person's coup attempt manufactured by foreign agents. If you want to see how far it can go, just think back to Belarus in 2020, where in a short period of time, Russia accused the United States of planning a coup, the Belarusian opposition accused Lukashenko of staging a coup, and Lukashenko accused both the Russians and the opposition of planning coups. So to clear things up, I'm just going to use a simplified definition for the purpose of this video. As far as this video is concerned, a few things have to be true for something to be a coup. It has to be launched by a member of the elite, part of the existing apparatus, either a member of the government or an oligarch or something similar. It needs to involve actual or implied force. So asking someone nicely to resign is not a coup. Asking them nicely to resign while surrounding them with armed men pointing guns at them probably is. The goal of the whole thing has to be the overthrow of the chief executive or equivalent. It has to be a plan to take over the apparatus of power, and it has to be illegal. This distinguishes coups from more general bad things like mutinies, revolutions, and revolts. When I say mutiny here, what I mean is any armed force acting against its officers or government. If soldiers refuse to fight until they're given better food and pay, that's a mutiny. If they march on the Capitol to install their commanding officer as the new president, that's a coup. Even applying a somewhat restrictive definition of what constitutes a coup, they are unfortunately common. One paper that looked into quantifying the subject identified 457 attempted coups between 1950 and 2010, with about 49.7% of them being successful. Of course, there's no requirement here for a coup to succeed for very long. Often coups are followed by counter-coups and rapid changes of government, along with presumable fits of depression in the office of anyone who's responsible for maintaining investor confidence under those circumstances. Modern coup attempts have been geographically concentrated, but not geographically exclusive. They're more common in Africa and the Americas, but Asia, the Middle East, and even Europe have seen their share of attempts. Going by the data, coups have generally become much less common since the end of the Cold War. However, their success rate has increased substantially. Although it would be interesting to see what adding the data post-2010 did to that particular calculation. All of this then leads back to the question of Wagner and whatever just happened, and whether it constitutes an actual coup attempt or just a mutiny. Going through our definition, it ticks some boxes. Prigozhin is an oligarch closely connected to leadership. Wagner are actively funded by the Russian government and serve as an extension of the Russian government's interests abroad. The Russian government was originally pretty clear that driving tanks towards Moscow and shooting down helicopters is pretty illegal, so yes, this is an attempt by members of the elite, and it is illegal, and of course once you're shooting down helicopters, there is an actual use of force. So as far as I'd argue, the only thing that determines whether this is just a mutiny or an actual coup attempt is what the goal of the entire thing was. If the goal was to replace Putin and seize control of the government, then this was a coup attempt. If the goal was just to secure some other concessions, for example, to see changes to the MOD or to have guarantees of safety or financial incentives or whatever, then this was probably just a mutiny, by the definitions we've used. Now, for better or worse, we probably can't get inside the head of Yevgeny Prigozhin, and he's unlikely to take any interview requests. So it's going to be hard to definitively answer that question. I'm going to play it safe and refer to this whole situation as a mutiny, but I certainly won't object to people calling a coup attempt if they believe that Prigozhin had much more expansive ambitions. Having decided what a coup is and isn't, we should ask the question of what makes for a good one. Because if we're going to do things like evaluate Wagner's chances for success, it can't hurt to look at some of the factors which historically have differentiated successful coups from unsuccessful ones. And in doing this, I just want to state for the record that I'm not encouraging anyone to go out there and overthrow their democratically elected governments. Please don't do coups. I'm just trying to identify common success and failure factors so that we can identify what sort of chances Wagner might have had they chosen to push on rather than taking a deal. Alright, so that said, let's talk about how to effectively overthrow a government. The first step is to gain the support of, or at least significant support from the armed and security forces. Because, as we said earlier, at the end of the day, in most states, it's the people with guns who are the ultimate expression of the authority of the existing state. So if you're going to try and upend the existing order in an illegal way, you're probably going to need the support of the people with guns. In some ways, it reminds me of a story my grandpa once told me. A young soldier opens the door to allow the three most powerful people in the country into a room for a meeting: the president, the wealthiest person, and the national religious leader. This is a moment of political crisis, negotiations break down, and it turns into a physical fight. So who, the question goes, is the most powerful person in the room? And the answer, my pa would argue, is the 18 or 19-year-old soldier guarding the door with the sidearm. If you're trying to stage a coup, it's unlikely all services are going to have the equal ability to help. Most people and functions of government tend to be on land, for example, so the Navy tends to be less useful as an objective than the Army. The more of the security services military you try and bring into the plot, the more likely you are to succeed and the more backup you're going to have if things go wrong. But you're also increasing the odds that someone will talk, you'll get found out, and you'll never get to launch your attempt. So if you just send an all-organisation email around asking who wants to stage a coup, you're probably not going to make it to the starting line. Likewise, if you miscalculate in this area and think you have support that you don't, things can go horribly wrong. When Napoleon returned from exile, for example, the royal government set the army to arrest him. The army then found him and promptly joined him, making, you have to admit, for one of history's easier coup attempts. Step 2 is to isolate and control the existing leadership and paralyse the existing structures. If there is a president, vice president, Supreme Court, legislature, etc., you want to get control of all of those individuals and organisations as quickly as possible. Because remember, your argument is that you are the legitimate authority now, you are now the one in charge, and it doesn't help having the previous person in charge running around disputing that fact. If they are not under control, they can do all sorts of damage, lobbying for additional support domestically or abroad, appealing to the population, challenging your narrative. And so failing to be successful here can have some pretty grave consequences. The failed coup in the final days of the USSR, for example, grabbed Gorbachev, but failed to get Yeltsin, whereas the failed Turkish coup of 2016 neither managed to capture or isolate President Erdogan. And in both cases, that made the next step really difficult, because the next step is to control communications and to control the narrative. You want to send a message out there, and you want that to be the only message on the airwaves on repeat. And that message, almost inevitably, is: this is a good thing, we are in charge now, and the whole coup is already over. There are reasons that message is really important. For one, if people think the whole thing is already over, why would they bother resisting for a forlorn cause? Alternatively, if they've just shut down the airwaves and no one has any idea what's going on, are they really going to take the risk of taking to the streets, breaking laws, using violence against troops when they don't know exactly what's happening? In an age of modern technologies, this is becoming increasingly difficult to do, just because there are so many more ways to communicate and it's hard to suppress all of them. In 2016, for example, Erdogan was able to jump on FaceTime and communicate with the population, telling them to come out onto the streets. And if opponents of your coup attempt are able to do that, then it can make the next step really difficult. Because having seized all the centres and apparatus of power, you now need to pacify the population. If you've overthrown a government everyone hates, then maybe this is no big deal. But in other circumstances, people might be a little bit miffed about the fact that you've just declared that you are in charge without having won an election and that Swan Lake is playing on loop on their TV, interrupting their favourite programs. Mass protests can actually be really dangerous to a new and vulnerable regime. Deploying force is one potential answer, but that risks alienating even more of the population, potentially some of those who supported you or who have sat on the fence so far disengaged, or potentially engaging the international community. A lot of things can go wrong. So in an ideal world, you need a plan to make sure the population is either supportive, disengaged to the point of apathy, and preferably a plan to deal with whatever percentage of the population is going to resist your attempt regardless. In Roman times, announcing entertaining games or free giveaways was one technique. In modern times, this might mean something like telling the public that you have access to a large supply of tickets to an unannounced Taylor Swift concert, and that if they all stay home like good citizens, they too will go into the draw to win some. There are more steps we could go through, but in the interest of time, we'll jump to the final lesson. And that is that you need to have a plan for if something goes wrong, and the ability to adapt on the fly. Say, for example, you didn't actually grab all of the consequential leaders, and now as a result, one of them is standing on top of the tank rallying the population. Or it turns out you had the support of less of the army than you thought you did, and the majority is now respectfully demanding that you return to barracks. In some cases, a failed coup can turn into a civil war. If you've taken control of some territory, have some troops and population loyal to you, but so does the previous government, and neither of you choose to back down, then you may be facing a potential civil war scenario. But if you have no plan or resources at all, then if your initial plan didn't succeed, you may no longer have a theory of victory. And it may be time to cut your losses, find a jet, and think about what country would be happy to take you in. I hear Belarus is lovely this time of year. Okay, so with those general rules in mind, let's turn to Wagner's attempt, starting with what we think we know about what actually happened. As we know, recent events took place in the context of a vicious public rivalry between Prigozhin and Wagner on one side, and Shoigu, Gerasimov, and a faction of the MOD on the other. As I said, this had gotten to the point of Wagner accusing the Russian military of deliberately planting mines on their retreat paths, and Wagner in turn kidnapping and allegedly torturing a lieutenant colonel of the Russian army. That, of course, is both incredibly confronting and proof that this relationship was at least 10% more toxic than your average office rivalry. Prigozhin had continuously and publicly criticised the MOD's handling of the war, and in the first half of June, the MOD shot back. They secured Putin's support for a ruling that all volunteer servicemen, including those in PMCs like Wagner, would be required to sign contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense by the 1st of July. That would be a massive blow to Wagner's independence and effectively bring its personnel under MOD control. Prigozhin shot back, saying that Wagner wouldn't sign any such contracts. But the MOD didn't budge, and we're left asking the question of what would have happened if the clock had hit 1 July without recent events taking place. Prigozhin, of course, as we all now know, wouldn't wait for the 1st of July and decided to act first. There's a lot of claims and allegations about what his plans and motivations were, how long he had planned it, who was ultimately in on it, and what the ultimate goal was. Almost all of that, however, I consider speculation and not worth spending too much time on. There is, however, one interesting hypothetical that occurred to me as I was going back through the timeline. And that is that back in early June, while the cross-border incursions into the Belgorod Oblast were taking place, Prigozhin had said Wagner would deploy to stop them. Ultimately, we know that move was resisted and never ended up happening. But if it had, Wagner possibly would have started the recent crisis many hundreds of kilometers closer to Moscow. Of course, they also wouldn't have started near Rostov-on-Don and the Southern Military District's headquarters, but it is an interesting hypothetical nonetheless. Instead, it seems, emphasis on seems here, that the plan was to quickly move from Wagner's bases to Rostov-on-Don, seize the Southern Military District headquarters, where it is rumoured Shoigu and Gerasimov were both meant to be present, followed, I presume, by question mark profit. On the 23rd of June, Prigozhin released a video attacking the fundamental justifications for the war in Ukraine. On the 24th of June, he moved Wagner from Ukraine into Russian territory and advanced on Rostov-on-Don. With duct tape armbands as their identifier, Wagner fighters moved into Rostov-on-Don, seized the military headquarters, apparently without firing a shot. Prigozhin released video of him in that military headquarters surrounded by a number of senior Russian military figures who had been disarmed. But tellingly, there was no Shoigu and no Gerasimov. Some claim this is because they were forewarned about the attempt, others because they were never there. But the key point is that Prigozhin had not captured his two primary opponents in the MOD. And so as news was spreading more and more widely about Wagner's actions, they split into two main groups. One, with Prigozhin, seems to have remained in Rostov-on-Don. There they occupied airfields, the military headquarters, and said they would not interfere in supply operations into Ukraine. They would allow officers to go about their business as normal. But Wagner supervisors would ensure that they didn't deploy force against Wagner's other efforts, that main other effort being sending a column towards Moscow. The Wagner column pushing towards Moscow appears to have emphasized speed. Heavy equipment like tanks and armored vehicles were put on their transporters and driven, but the crews were kept in the vehicles ready to go into action at a moment's notice, or even engage from the back of their transporters. Scouts seem to have moved ahead, and several logistics and support vehicles were seen embedded in the column. These Wagner troops don't appear to have attempted to secure territory or disarm Russian military units as they moved forward. Instead, they bypassed any potential centres of resistance and pushed on as fast as possible towards the capital. In some ways, the Wagner column racing towards Moscow looked, as Prigozhin would later put it, a lot like what the Russian operation towards Kyiv was meant to be. A rapid operation bypassing centres of resistance intended to take the centre of power rapidly against an opponent that was disoriented by the speed and not particularly keen on resisting. The key here is not to mistake Wagner moving through a particular piece of territory with them seizing and controlling it. If I drive across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, I don't get to claim I own it as a result. At the time this was happening, I remember watching Twitter and seeing people posting maps with entire oblasts represented in purple, claiming Wagner control, saying the city of Voronezh had fallen. In reality, it seems Wagner's power only really existed in the heart of Rostov-on-Don, where part of the force was based, and then within line of sight of the convoy along that M4 highway. Most of the Wagner force appears to have bypassed Voronezh, gone around, and continued on its passage towards Moscow. If you only have a few thousand troops, you can attempt a thunder run. You probably can't attempt to hold and occupy an area of territory larger than many countries. The initial response by the Russian political elite seems to have been confusion, followed by brave and rapid attempts to relocate out of Moscow. Because when you finally come to the conclusion that giving the hardened criminal a private army of hardened criminals was not in fact a good idea after all, then I suppose leaving makes a certain brand of sense. Flight trackers observed the private jets of many of Russia's senior political leaders, wealthy and elite, leaving the city. The price of tickets leaving the city for ordinary people skyrocketed in some cases to 10 times the ordinary price. Because, hey, if you're an airline and there might be a revolution on, that's no good reason not to attempt to make some significant quarterly profit. And significantly, A, neither Shoigu or Gerasimov appeared on TV or appeared to communicate in any way, shape or form. Secondly, flight trackers saw one of Putin's jets leaving Moscow and then turning off its transponder. And third, Wagner-linked social media channels and Prigozhin himself amplified stories of more and more of the Russian military joining Wagner as they continued their march. Notably, we didn't actually see much evidence of that actually happening. But the message was sent and amplified, and many on Twitter rapidly became convinced that much of the Russian army was now squarely on Team Wagner. Eventually, the president would appear on TV, leaving no doubt about where Putin stood. And his position wasn't particularly ambiguous. Without saying Prigozhin's name even once, he declared that the leaders of Wagner's revolt had betrayed their country and their people. He compared the danger and the situation to 1917, the year of military collapse, mutiny, and revolution in Russia during the First World War. And notably, he declared that all involved would be severely punished for this uprising, and that orders had been issued to that effect. Following that speech, at least one Wagner-linked Telegram channel put out a message saying the president had made a terrible mistake, but it didn't matter because Russia would soon have a new president. This was widely reported as Wagner saying that they intended to overthrow Putin. What that misses, of course, is that there are multiple Wagner-linked Telegram channels controlled by different individuals. And as defences were prepared around the city of Moscow, Prigozhin himself made no equivalent statement declaring any intent to overthrow Putin. As Wagner moved towards Moscow, there is evidence that resistance took place. The only resistance we can confirm for sure at this stage came from the Russian aerospace forces, although there are certainly rumours skirmishes took place on the ground as well. During this stage of the operation, the world was treated to some truly bizarre sights and sounds. We saw Kadyrov's troops claiming they were going to Rostov-on-Don to fight Wagner, before declaring that they had been stuck in a traffic jam and thus couldn't fight. We saw dump trucks full of sand being prepared as barricades to block the freeway, and video, in one case taken by a Russian appearing to stand in a parking lot, watching units of the Russian aerospace forces attempt to engage the Wagner convoy, while the Wagner convoy engaged right back. Because while there were clearly air attacks launched against the M4 highway, the Wagner convoy had teeth. Namely, the convoy was protected by at least some Pantsir and Strela 10 short-range air defense systems. And by the time the convoy had rolled past Voronezh and was pushing towards Moscow, it had shot down by that point a significant number of Russian helicopters and at least one fixed-wing aircraft. At this point, many were convinced that Wagner forces would soon reach Moscow, and from there, who knew what would happen next? After all, it was going to be a small force of hardened mercenaries with a supply of heavy equipment against Rosgvardia, traffic cops, and whatever the city of Moscow could throw together. Then, as suddenly as it all started, it was over. In terms of what we actually know about the deal that ended the Wagner March on Moscow, the honest answer is very little. All we know is what Prigozhin, the Russian government, and Lukashenko have chosen to tell us. It was announced that a deal had been brokered. Wagner would receive clemency for their actions. Prigozhin would be allowed to go to Belarus. Wagner troops would be allowed to go to Belarus, sign contracts with the MOD, or simply to go home. No one would be punished for occupying a Russian city, gunning down Russian helicopters, or driving on the capital with tanks and armoured vehicles. Prigozhin said he had stopped because it had become clear that to go further, Russian blood would have to be spilt. He was apparently unwilling to do so, and so had ordered his columns to turn around. Now again, given that he had already shot down a significant number of Russian aircraft and killed a number of pilots, I suppose we can only take his statement as proof of the assertion, long put forward by many Air Force pilots, that pilots truly do stand apart from the rest of the human race. Back in Rostov-on-Don, the Wagner troops loaded back onto their transports, and as they prepared to move out of the city back to their field camps, as you can see from some of the images there, did so to the cheers and adulation of some in the Rostov-on-Don population. And just like that, it seemed to be over. There's one final part of the march that I feel I need to address here before we move on to the aftermath. And that is the theory that Wagner never intended to go to Moscow, and that the reason that this thing ended was because Wagner had reached its real objective. Off the path from Voronezh, there is a facility called Voronezh 45. This is a nuclear weapons storage facility. The claim advanced by some is that Wagner was going to get to this facility, obtain nuclear weapons, and that was going to become Prigozhin's bargaining chip. Now, of course, I can't conclusively prove otherwise, but I do think that this is very unlikely. For one, we haven't seen any evidence that Wagner actually reached and seized the facility. Secondly, we're not sure if the facility is currently storing warheads. Thirdly, if it is storing warheads, it's likely that they will not be fully assembled, but rather in a state of readiness, meaning that they have to be physically put together before they're useful. And while your average Wagner mercenary may be good at a great many things, nuclear warhead assembly is probably not one of their key recruitable skills. Even if a warhead was then assembled, the Russians don't tend to store delivery systems and warheads together at facilities like this. So you get either the missiles or the warhead, but not both. And there's nothing about the path that Wagner took that suggests they would have gotten their hands on any Iskanders or similar delivery systems. But let's just say Prigozhin's fabulously wealthy, he had managed to buy himself an Iskander system and had it hidden away somewhere. Even if he had the delivery system and the warhead, there would then be the process of integrating the warhead and the delivery system, which requires, again, proficient staff, and time. Finally, Russian warheads should have permissive action links on them, that is, they should require codes in order to make them usable. Or at least that is reportedly the case with the tactical type of warheads we're talking about here. Whereas America has one nuclear briefcase, the football that follows the president, Russia has 3. And they are reportedly in the hands of the president, the chief of the general staff, and the minister of defense. So yeah, Shoigu and Gerasimov. Seeing as it is unlikely that either Shoigu or Gerasimov were supporting a campaign seemingly aimed at removing them from their positions for gross incompetence, it seems unlikely Wagner would have had any easy ability to unlock nuclear munitions if it got its hands on them. And so if there was a threat of nuclear compromise, there would have been plenty of time for Putin and his government to take drastic measures to ensure that control of nuclear weapons was not lost before they could potentially be used. So again, I'm not saying it's impossible. I can't say it's impossible. But for the moment at least, it doesn't seem like there was any credible nuclear gambit included in Wagner's plan. I've seen no credible visual evidence of any fighting at the site, nor anything reliable that would convince me that Wagner forces even got there. Now, putting a positive spin on a mercenary mutiny leading to an almost unopposed multi-hundred-kilometre march towards your capital is a big ask. But that didn't stop many in the Russian and Belarusian political elite trying in the following days. Lukashenko would publicly take credit for negotiating an end to the crisis, leaving out the role, if any, of other Russian political figures who are rumoured to have played a role in the negotiation process. Prigozhin said his march had achieved what it needed to and cast himself as a noble figure for being unwilling to spill Russian blood. And Putin would go out and congratulate the military and Rosgvardia on their excellent work and resolve in resisting the coup attempt, and said that civil society had been strong. State TV tried a number of new propaganda angles. These ranged from arguing that some breaking of laws was understandable during times of war, to this was just a traditional dust-up between Russian boyars, to denying there was any armed mutiny at all. Some figures who seemed to have gone to ground during the crisis slowly began to reappear. Sergei Shoigu, for example, the great survivor, appeared a number of times. Meanwhile, as at time of recording, no new footage of either Generals Gerasimov or Surovikin has been released. There are still a lot of rumours flying around about the state of various individuals, and only time will tell who's truly left standing after this is all over. Finally, and perhaps most remarkably, despite the announcement that Wagner fighters would be given a choice to sign up with the MOD, retire, or go to Belarus, it's reported that Wagner is now largely recruiting as normal. Journalists who called Wagner recruiting centres, posing as potential recruits, found that everything was pretty normal. They were being directed towards training centres in Russia. And in one case, when the investigator asked about the whole Wagner are potentially traitors thing, the recruiter responded, essentially saying, if we were traitors, why would we still be in Russia? I expect many in the Russian Ministry of Defense are currently asking themselves the same question. Now, before we move on to the impacts all of this is likely to have on Russia and its war in Ukraine, I thought it was worth asking 2 questions. Firstly, if there was no deal, could Prigozhin and Wagner have succeeded? After all, many seem convinced that they quit when they were ahead and about to take Moscow. And secondly, I wanted to quickly address some of the potential conspiracy theories that have already started to spring up about this unusual chain of events. When people ask the first question, could Wagner have won if they kept going, I think they're usually asking about the coup question. If you're asking just about could Wagner have succeeded in a mutiny, then I could argue they already did. Prigozhin and Wagner took up arms against the state, openly and in public, and they managed to cut themselves a deal as a result. But if you're asking whether or not Prigozhin could have occupied Moscow, overthrown Putin, and imposed a new government, well, then I think the answer is pretty clearly no, and you could argue the entire effort was pretty bloody dumb. Because if you compare Wagner's efforts to the scorecard for coups that we designed earlier, then they seem to have been failing with significant gusto. Prigozhin had failed to isolate and control the leadership. Most of the Russian government had relocated from Moscow to St. Petersburg. He'd failed to capture Shoigu or Gerasimov. And even worse, he had no prospect of realistically doing so in the near future, if at all. So far as controlling the narrative, that was obviously impossible, with state media still on air calling him a traitor. And the plan for, if it all went wrong, seems to have been to send a couple of thousand blokes towards Moscow and hope it all works out. Some of this may have made sense if Prigozhin expected more units of the Russian military or Rosgvardia to join him. But as things actually played out, you could argue he didn't have a particularly strong hand when the deal was finally struck. People have said Wagner was really close to taking Moscow, leaving aside the fact that in terms of population, Moscow is 170 times larger than Bakhmut. Even if there was absolutely no resistance, a force of a few thousand Wagner troops would never truly occupy Moscow. They could control parts of it, to be sure, but they would be surrounded by 11 million potentially hostile Muscovites. And that's assuming they could take those core buildings at all. There was a Rosgvardia and police presence in Moscow. And as we've seen in Ukraine, even a small number of defenders choosing to make a determined effort in that sort of urban environment could have made it an absolute death trap for a Wagner force trying to assault from the march. Unless significant forces change sides, I'd argue it just wasn't realistic. And even if you do take Moscow, what then? Reportedly by this point, much of the Russian government has relocated towards St. Petersburg. In many ways, this is kind of like the problem I point out with the Russian theory of a quick victory in Ukraine. It relies on your opponent giving up just because you get a good punch in. If they don't, what are you going to do? Start another convoy from Moscow to St. Petersburg and hope they don't get on a plane from there as well? All of this, of course, could have been very, very ugly if it came to a fight. But my basic premise is, without large-scale military defections and defections within the government, a few thousand Wagnerites in Red Square ultimately weren't going to achieve anything, other than, of course, guaranteeing that Ukraine would run out of popcorn for as long as the operation continued. As a mutiny aimed at forcing a deal, Wagner had a theory of victory. But if it was intended as a coup, I'd argue it was probably a doomed venture. As for the question of conspiracy theories, most of these focus on the idea that somehow this whole thing was staged, that this thing looks like such an abysmal, chaotic train wreck of an event that there must be some 6D chess going on. As a general rule, I feel like a lot of conspiracy theories grow out of the idea that there must be a reason behind everything we observe, that governments and organisations must be led by cunning and capable puppet masters and strategic geniuses. And anything that looks like stupidity, incompetence, or random chance is in fact just another act in a 7D chess match. To which I just say that anyone who has worked in any organisation, any business, or government will probably know how wrong that statement is. Sometimes stupid is just stupid. And so while we can probably never comprehensively disprove a conspiracy theory, we can quickly go through and check whether or not they make any sense from a perspective of motive, impact, and available evidence. Noting, of course, that I don't know is always an acceptable alternative explanation. For example, a lot of people commented or sent me emails suggesting this whole thing may have been cover to allow Russia to redeploy Wagner to Belarus for a surprise attack against Ukraine from the north. The idea here is that part of Wagner could pretend to be moving towards Moscow, but in fact they would just redeploy to Belarus afterwards and catch Ukraine off guard. But personally, I'd just raise the counterpoint that if you wanted Wagner in Belarus, why not just deploy Wagner to Belarus? Why do you have to stage a mutiny? Why do you have to cause political disruption? Why do you have to shoot down helicopters and cause all this chaos? Especially since now, instead of a potentially quiet relocation where you put people in civilian clothing and move them slowly and move equipment at night and all the other things you could do, you've now publicly announced an intention to move Wagner to Belarus, and everyone knows that's where you're saying that they're going. Moving Wagner would have been more subtle and quicker without all of this than with it. Similarly, the claim I've seen that this was set up between Prigozhin and Putin to arrange for the removal of Shoigu and or Gerasimov. Namely, that if Vladimir Putin wanted to remove Shoigu or Gerasimov, why not just fire Shoigu and Gerasimov? I'm not a Kremlin whisperer, but it's clear they both have a lot of internal enemies, and simply removing them would have been a lot less damaging and safer than staging this whole event. Even worse, if Putin were to remove Shoigu and Gerasimov after this mutiny, it would look like he was giving in to Prigozhin's demands, weakening his position. If Emutopia, for example, was planning to eventually ban the sale of new petrol-powered cars in order to bring down emissions, sure, that might be perfectly doable. But if before the law passed, a Tesla-sponsored PMC rolled into the capital and started threatening people, demanding that the sale of non-electric cars be banned, then suddenly doing the thing I was going to do anyway becomes politically untenable because now it looks like I'm giving in to an armed group. I absolutely negotiate with terrorists is not a great election platform. Okay, so with all that said, what are some key observations we can make about the mutiny as we witnessed it, and what might it mean for Russia and its war going forward? Observation number one, I would argue, is the shocking paralysis and apathy of many of Russia's military and security services in response to the Wagner uprising. Putin may have said that the security services were effective, determined, and decisive in putting down the revolt, but we have plenty of images of Russian military units just watching Wagner units roll on by. There were pro-Russian sources claiming that Wagner was moving so quickly that it was difficult for the command in the VKS to get strikes organised against a long convoy of vehicles that were moving on the freeway. And while it's true that Wagner did have heavy equipment available to them than many of these units did, often these Wagner forces were moving in column on a road, drawn out with their vehicles on the back of transporters. It wouldn't have taken much to slow them down or stop them in their tracks. We saw that in Ukraine. But instead, while a lot of Russian leaders and Russian military units didn't seem particularly keen on actively joining and supporting Wagner, they also didn't seem particularly keen on fighting them either. Most of them instead just seemed to have kept their head down, stepped aside, and waited for it all to be over. You saw a similar sort of apathy and indifference from much of the Russian civilian population. Even after Putin had given his speech explaining that this was an act of mutiny, this was an act of treason and betrayal that endangered Russia, we still saw images of large crowds in Rostov-on-Don just sort of watching the mercenaries do their work like it was some sort of spectator sport. Some of the street sweepers continued to work meters away from vehicles that were pointing their cannons at a Russian military headquarters. And while on one hand, of course, that's very noble for a municipal worker, I'm sure many councils would be very happy to have workers who will complete their tasks under any circumstances, including an uprising by trained killers. This was hardly a firm response by civil society against what Wagner were trying to do. Compare this, for example, to the coup attempt in Turkey not that many years ago. There, the population came out on the streets. There, ordinary civilians laid themselves down in front of tanks to block movement or clambered over them or risked life and limb in clashes with the troops. This was civil society responding to an attempted coup. Ukrainian veterans and civilians turning up and volunteering to fight without waiting for mobilization orders in the opening hour of the February invasion in 2022. That was a strong civil response. Sweeping the streets and taking selfies was not. And perhaps you can't blame the Russian public for not putting their lives on the line to block Wagner or defend the government, because it seemed like precious few of the elite were willing to do so either. Political and military leaders didn't exactly rush to condemn the coup before Putin spoke. Many of the political elite seemed focused on being anywhere other than Moscow. Many hours would pass between the beginning of Wagner's activities and Putin finally making a statement on national TV. Now, that may have been because he was relocating, or the delay may have been for some other reason. The point in the end is it almost doesn't matter. What matters is it looked, to a lot of Russians and foreign observers, like the elite were in self-preservation mode. And in circumstances like this historically, appearances matter. When Ashraf Ghani fled Afghanistan in 2021, that image mattered. When Zelensky went out onto the streets of Kyiv and took a selfie video declaring that he was staying, that appearance mattered. Indeed, you could even point out that when threatened with potential overthrow, Alexander Lukashenko appeared on the streets, in gear, with a Kalashnikov. Now, was Lukashenko anywhere near protesters? No. Was it ever likely that he was going to go and personally gun down demonstrators? Also no. But it served as a statement of determination and permanency, whereas it's entirely possible that if he'd chosen to flee the country at that critical moment, things could have ended differently. The next thing to call out is just how incredibly open the road to Moscow seemed to be. Russia claims to be a military superpower. But when the capital itself was threatened, when a mercenary force in column was trying to advance from Rostov-on-Don all the way to Moscow, we didn't exactly see a ring of steel being formed around the capital. We saw a disjointed series of air attacks on the convoy, which resulted in helicopter losses and did not succeed in halting it. We saw dump trucks being repurposed as barricades, and we saw Rosvardia and ordinary cops working together to put together sandbag fighting positions with grenade machine guns or light weapons. There were, of course, some Rosvardia BTRs, but no tanks or heavy armour. There was a period there where I would have been genuinely unsurprised if they'd hurriedly pushed a parade tank or two into service. It would have been a heck of a redemption story for the T-14 Armata if one or two examples had been reactivated for the defence of the capital, even if it was from Russian forces. Under ordinary circumstances, there would be a number of Russian heavy military units based relatively close to Moscow. The base of 4th Guards Tank Division, for example, is I think only about 70 kilometres away from the capital. But that unit had a very bad time in Ukraine at the Battle of Trostyanets, and despite not having completely reconstituted, was later slammed again at Izium. And so it seems to have been Rosvardia, cops, cadets, and even reportedly bringing in work crews to excavate part of the road. If there was ever a clue that Russia didn't have massive ready-to-go military reserves in the Moscow military district, I think the way this operation played out provides it. Unless, of course, Russian authorities thought Wagner would be more dissuaded by the threat of traffic fines than they would by the prospect of going head-to-head with a Guards tank unit, leading us to the final observations around the way it ended. And that was with Prigozhin, a man who had been publicly accused of treason, very publicly, along with all of his men, receiving a pardon. All charges dropped. In Rostov-on-Don, some locals chose to take selfies with Wagner soldiers, these apparent traitors, while Prigozhin, when he finally left, got something of a rock star's send-off. Now obviously the people choosing to stand in the streets and act in this way aren't representative of all Russians, they can't be. But you have to admit it certainly looked like a bizarre ending to the whole affair. Add to the fact there seemed to be a lot of those online on both extremes disappointed with how things had turned out. Both Prigozhin and Putin won themselves thousands of the highly regarded clown emoji on Telegram, with Putin receiving that response from many mill-blogger channels that believed he should have been far harsher on the Wagner uprising, while Prigozhin was digitally jeered for backing down. As it became clear that Russia had avoided further violent escalation, it similarly became clear that there was a loud minority out there that was almost disappointed. Sad to see neither Wagner troops raising their flag in Red Square or Prigozhin face down in a ditch. I'm not sure what it says about the political polarization of a country when there's a significant minority legitimately disappointed that civil war didn't break out. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most important part of this discussion. What exactly does all this mean, and what are the likely impacts of Wagner's mutiny? The first thing to say on that front is don't expect some sudden and rapid change, either on the battlefield or in Russian politics. Prigozhin's actions may have been dramatic, but they didn't suddenly fill in Russian trenches, disarm Russian mines, or remove the Russian army from the front in Ukraine. Even during Wagner's occupation of Rostov-on-Don, they went to great pains to stress that supply would continue to flow as normal. And the push logistics system of the Russian military has such inertia behind it that even if the entire Russian political leadership was suddenly zapped out of existence and replaced by a lettuce, for a while at least you would expect the supplies to continue to flow as normal. Very little, if any, of the regular military appears to have thrown in with Prigozhin. And while Wagner were a useful tool for the Russian military during campaigns like the Bakhmut one, they weren't currently engaged in holding any area of the front. They were in reserve, rebuilding. So as General Zaluzhny noted, it's not like this uprising caused there to be any sudden weakening of the front anywhere along the front lines in Ukraine. Likewise, many were quick to declare that Putin was done, Putin was finished, Putin was a spent force. And yet, for now, there he still stands, with a number of cards left to play. But while the short-term effects may ultimately be limited, that doesn't mean the Wagner mutiny changed nothing. Starting, I think, with the consequences for Wagner and Russian operations abroad. As we've discussed before, Wagner have long been a tool for Russian power projection abroad, an asset in hybrid warfare. The group has been active around the world, getting their hands dirty in order to further Russian influence and secure resources. Now there are two main questions about those efforts. Firstly, will Wagner continue to carry them out, or will these efforts be taken over by the Russian Ministry of Defense or some other force? Prigozhin and Wagner have built up interests across places like Africa, and it seems unlikely the Russian government would want to forfeit those, either allowing Wagner to continue or attempting to take them over more directly. But of course, there is a reason in the past that Wagner rather than regular Russian forces were used, and at least part of that was the importance of deniability. Wagner would go places and do things the Russian government didn't want to do itself. It would get its hands dirty in a variety of demonetizing ways. And whenever there were allegations against Wagner, well, the Russian government could just say that is a PMC, it is nothing to do with us. However, as part of this recent dust-up, Vladimir Putin came out and said that Wagner had been fully supported by the Russian state and had received more than $2 billion in payments just over the course of one 12-month period. Now that kind of undermines the whole deniability thing. If you have a military unit based in Russia, staffed primarily by Russians, led by a Russian, reporting largely to the Russian government and extensively armed and financially supported by them, then it probably wouldn't be a long bow to draw for a lawyer or government to suggest that maybe some of Wagner's excesses overseas should be at least partly attributed to the Russian government. Now, Dmitry Peskov has since come out and said, yes, Wagner is financed by the Russian government, but we promise that all of Wagner's operations in Africa are totally independent. But we'll see how well that line plays at home and abroad. There's also reporting that some of Prigozhin's media assets, including his internet troll farms, are either likely to be taken over or potentially shut down and the employees fired. A takeover in this case would realistically mean those assets coming under the control of the Russian government or someone sufficiently close to Putin. With that change either way, Prigozhin's personal control over online discourse would be significantly diminished. Of course, that doesn't mean that everyone is going to suddenly forget the things that Prigozhin said just before he launched his mutiny, or indeed in the months leading up to it. Before the Wagner troops began moving, Prigozhin recorded a speech. In it, he went point by point through the Kremlin's talking point justifications for the February 2022 invasion and comprehensively demolished them. He denied that Ukraine had been systemically shelling the Donbass civilians for 8 years, talking instead only about some exchange of artillery fire between military positions. He denied that Ukraine was in any need of demilitarization or denazification. He denied that there was any imminent plan of attack or threat from NATO or Ukraine. And indeed, he went all the way back to Zelensky's original election, saying that when Zelensky came to power, he genuinely was ready to negotiate, if only the Russian leadership had been willing to, as he put it, come down from Mount Olympus. Instead, he argued the war was launched to serve certain special interests. Sergei Shoigu, he alleged, wanted to get famous, wanted a martial star for winning a quick and victorious war. Oligarchs, who he put it, who had succeeded in looting the occupied Donbass for years, were interested in doing the same to much more of Ukraine. Interestingly, he left out any specific allegation that Vladimir Putin might have had ambitions and a reason for launching the invasion. But he slammed leaders like Shoigu and challenged the official narrative as to how the war was going. He denied the accuracy of official Russian loss statistics, and when he gave his own number for daily losses, it was 1,000 killed, wounded, sanitary, and refusing to fight. In essence, he described a conflict that was not geopolitically necessary, but instead launched to further special and corrupt interests. And he alleged that war was being hard fought at great Russian cost. And having said all of this, having publicly challenged the basis for the so-called special military operation and the success and prospects of that operation, now he would receive pardon. It's kind of like tearing down the CEO in front of the entire firm, and then turning up to work the next day as if nothing had happened. Everyone might smile and pretend that everything is normal, but no one's going to forget what they heard. Far more concrete than issues of messaging or image, however, are the actual casualties suffered by the Russian forces as a result of Wagner's operation. We don't know how many troops, if any, were killed or wounded on the ground. It is in the interests of all involved to pretend that nothing happened there and not a shot was fired. But what we do know is that losses occurred in the air. Wagner's convoy had both Pantsir and Strela systems with it, and we know the crews manning them were not exactly trigger-shy, because in a truly black day for the VKS, Wagner's gunners shot down or damaged a Kar-52 attack helicopter, a Mi-35M, 3 Mi-8 electronic warfare helicopters, an Mi-8 transport, and an Il-22M airborne command post. None of those aircraft or their crews can be written off as low value. The Kar-52s have been a deadly weapon against Ukrainian armoured thrusts. The Mi-8 electronic warfare helicopters are capable of undermining opposing ground-based air defences. while also being incredibly rare. 3 Mi-8 EW variants would be about 20% of the pre-war Russian fleet. And the IL-22M, well, that was arguably even more valuable. There's only about 12 of those in Russian service pre-war, although there are more of older versions doing similar tasks. The aircraft carries out vital radio relay, command and control functions, and as a result, they've always flown in the safety of Russian airspace. Until, that is, one Wagner air defense gunner decided that the totally unarmed airborne command post must have posed a clear and present danger to their convoy of armoured vehicles and shot it out of the sky. Along with the crew, if current reporting is to be believed, including at least 1 lieutenant colonel, 2 majors, and 3 captains. While the number of lost aircrew obviously pales in comparison to the number of ground forces troops killed or wounded every day fighting in Ukraine, the harsh utilitarian reality is that it's usually a lot easier to replace frontline infantry recruits than it is to rapidly generate new experienced aviation officers. So these are losses that the VKS will definitely notice, feel, and one questions how quickly they'll forgive them. But if you're looking for things that might directly impact the fighting in Ukraine, I think what was lost is less important than what might now be diverted back to the homeland rather than to the fighting in Ukraine. However it's spun, it's kind of remarkable that during this time of crisis, there was relatively little very heavy equipment available to go and defend Moscow from a Wagner force which had to travel all the way from Rostov-on-Don. People had laughed when Russia's Victory Day parade only had a single T-34-85 to lead it without any modern tanks available. That was surprising to many observers, but could always have been a stylistic or symbolic choice. But while not rolling out the tanks for a parade might be a stylistic choice, not rolling them out when there are a group of mercenaries potentially coming to kill you, well, that seems less like a stylistic choice and more a pretty strong indicator that they simply weren't there. So the question becomes, if a lot of your Praetorian units with their heavy weapons went to Ukraine and got wrecked or are still needed there, what do you do about securing the capital? Do you risk pulling units back in order to ensure that you have armour in reserve to avoid any of these embarrassing situations again, but in so doing weaken your forces on the battlefields of Ukraine, or do you take the risk and change nothing? Ultimately, it's hard to know if Russia will choose to pull any of its heavy units back or move them closer to Moscow, but I think we have received one clue that a third option might be under serious consideration. Some of you probably remember Viktor Zolotov. Zolotov's main qualifications consist of being Putin's bodyguard and security chief for 13 years, and then being appointed the Minister of Internal Affairs, the commander of Russia's internal troops, and eventually the commander of Rosgvardia. Now, you might suggest that years as a bodyguard or head of security are not proof of qualification to run something the size of Rosgvardia. Then again, he allegedly built a family fortune worth many millions of dollars on a bodyguard's salary, so maybe he is just a genius. We've talked before about the immense size of Russia's internal security budget and associated forces. Rosgvardia itself in 2022 was more than 1/3 strong, and reportedly had approximately 1,600 wheeled APCs and other armoured vehicles in service, but no heavy armour and very, very little artillery. That, Zolotov indicates, is about to change. Speaking soon after the end of the Wagner Mutiny, Zolotov described the performance of Rosgvardia during the crisis as excellent, while also saying that his forces would now be receiving heavy weapons and tanks. From the point of view of regime security, that makes a degree of sense. Zolotov is regarded as loyal and reliable, Rosgvardia are primarily there for the purpose of regime security and stability, and while BTRs might be enough to deal with protesters, if the threat profile includes rebellious mercenary units with heavy equipment, or even potentially rebellious army units, then it stands to reason that Rosgvardia should have access to heavy weapons with which to meet that threat head-on. In other words, one of the responses to the threat posed by the parallel military structure represented by Wagner is to build up an additional parallel military structure represented by Rosgvardia. Jokes aside, the key question with this development is where are the new tanks, artillery pieces, or heavy weapons for Rosgvardia meant to come from? Russia has a finite supply of both. We've seen older and older systems being reactivated, and the consumption rate almost certainly well exceeds the rate of new production. We've seen T-62s doing frontline duty, we've seen trains loaded with T-55s going to Crimea. But something tells me Zolotov and the Russian leadership won't be happy with his force driving T-55s or ancient T-62s around Russian cities where the cameras might see them. And in the end, whatever heavy equipment gets transferred to Rosvardia to be kept in the Russian interior to protect the regime, the government, and societal stability is going to be equipment that never makes it to the battlefields of Ukraine where it is sorely needed. If anything, you could argue the trend should be going in the other direction, with Rosvardia transferring personnel and heavy equipment to the regular army in order to support the war effort. But after recent developments, I would be shocked if that is in fact what we saw. Because historically, many governments, when given a choice between regime security and military utility, will opt for regime security almost every time. And as for the regular army, the question now becomes whether we're going to see any sort of political purge to follow. After all, there were some in the military who it seems chose to stand aside rather than intervene against Wagner, and there may have been those who had sympathies with Prigozhin's attempt. Now the FSB and the Russian government have a number of choices about how to approach the issue, and whichever way they go, I'd argue none of them are without costs. If you don't punish anyone or punish them too little, then you're not going to provide any disincentive in the future from anyone either acting with rebellious intent, like Prigozhin and some of Wagner, or if something's taking place, standing aside rather than doing their job, stepping in and defending the regime. Think about it from a game theory perspective. If there's no punishment for standing aside and doing nothing during a coup attempt or a mutiny, well then you're almost always going to choose to stand aside. If the existing government wins, great, you carry on as you did before, and you do it without risking life or limb. Meanwhile, if the opposition wins, well, they're going to thank you for standing aside, not getting in the way, and once again, you probably get to stay in your position. Meanwhile, if you step in and back the wrong side, then you might be killed or wounded during the event, or purged afterwards if you pick the wrong side. Step it up by punishing people, but not punishing them too harshly, disciplinary proceedings, demotions, but keeping them in the forces. Well, you're creating a further disincentive in the future against standing aside, but you also run the risk of creating a bunch of resentment amongst people who are now still in your military structures, still have power, and may be motivated to try and kick you out in the future. Punish people harshly, however, throw people in prison for dereliction of duty, lock up those who conspired with Wagner or who willingly stood aside during a time of crisis. And yes, you may reimpose discipline and encourage people to actually do their jobs properly during the next repeat. But that potentially is going to cost you trained military officers and manpower who right now you need more than ever. From a military utility perspective, there's not much difference between Ukraine killing 10 generals in missile strikes and you locking them up in prison. Either way, they're no longer doing their job. And ultimately, however you choose to play this, whether you choose to turn the other cheek or take a page right out of the Stalin playbook, there's still a genuine danger of creating a culture of distrust within the military. Officers and men might be asking what side the other person is really on. What did they know? And of all the battling factions above them, who ultimately do these people support? Effective militaries have to be built on a degree of trust and cohesion. And when you're talking about a future in which ex-Wagner operatives are integrated into the regular military, I'm not exactly sure how easy that sort of cohesion and trust will be to achieve. I'm aware there are those out there who dispute whether or not this was a good thing for Putin or not, whether seeing off a challenger in fact entrenched his position. With the argument sometimes being that the majority of observers and members of the public who point to this as a potential demonstration of weakness are getting it wrong. Part of what I'd say to that is that what everyone perceives and believes in this sort of situation absolutely matters. If you do something that causes everyone to believe that you are weak, then that may cause them to act against you next time there is a crisis or not to come to your assistance, whether that original action actually means you are weak or not. And in this case, I'd argue a lot of people saw weakness in the way the Wagner Mutiny played out. The business world saw instability in Russia, which is already, it seems, having an economic impact. Whether you believe Putin was nobly trying to limit bloodshed or looking out for self-preservation when he apparently left Moscow, what a lot of the Russian public and foreign observers will have seen was an apparently open road to Moscow, mercenaries seizing control of a city of more than 1 million residents. Putin's government officials fleeing Moscow, the prices for tickets skyrocketing, a mercenary leader who would receive forgiveness after killing Russian pilots and staging an act of mutiny, as well as, at least for a short moment, being able to imagine at the very least what Russia would look like if Vladimir Putin wasn't in charge. On some channels, Putin's speeches managed truly spectacular dislike-to-like ratios. And even on Russian propaganda TV, there were those commentators who couldn't stop themselves noting, that letting open treason go unpunished was kind of a difficult thing to stomach. Meanwhile, for the Ukrainians, who were midway through a costly, tiring counteroffensive, they got to see Russia wobble. They got to see evidence that Russian stability is not absolute, and that with enough pressure and enough time, great things might be possible. I don't think anyone in Ukraine should have been cheering for a world in which Prigozhin won and became the ruler of Russia somehow. It's important not to forget who he and Wagner are. But his mutiny did demonstrate that the Russian government might not be invulnerable. And for Western governments and Ukrainians trying to find the strength, will and determination to carry on in the long term, that may ultimately matter. In conclusion, regarding the details of what happened during the Wagner Mutiny, I don't know what happened and neither do you. There are huge unanswered questions around the nature of the uprising, who was in on it, and what the ultimate terms of the amnesty at the end were, as well as what will happen next. I'd argue that based on what we saw, Wagner's attempt didn't have much chance of actually capturing Moscow and even less of decisively overthrowing the Russian government, unless more of the security services threw in with him than they appear to. But that doesn't mean the whole affair is without significant impact. If Russian narratives have been undermined, if stability has been challenged, if equipment has to be repurposed for Rosgvardia rather than the regular military, or purges and distrust weaken that regular army, then the ultimate beneficiaries of this whole affair probably won't be Prigozhin, Putin, or any member of the Russian elite, it'll be Ukraine. That said, the path forward is very much uncertain. We don't know who will be purged, who will be interrogated, or whether a softly approach will ultimately be followed. And so I suspect this is something we're going to have to keep a close eye on, monitoring how the Russian army and security services choose to deal with this interesting chain of events, and what it ultimately ends up meaning for Prigozhin, Wagner, Russia, Ukraine, and the government of Vladimir Putin. Okay, brief channel update to close out, and this was yet another case of an emergent topic interrupting the usual flow of events, but I thought that this one was important to cover regardless. It was an incredible chain of events, and while there's still a lot of unknowns, I think we do have enough information available to talk about it, and I hope you've enjoyed doing so today. I'm hoping to return to a more regular product set next week, but who knows, maybe something else dramatic will happen which will once again force me to change my topic order. So far as the channel goes more broadly, I'm getting back on top of things slowly. I hope to be chewing through a backlog of messages and emails this week. I am travelling for part of it, so expect that to happen towards the second half of the week, but I should be out with another video next week as planned, as well as some new and interesting updates. As always, thank you very much for your engagement and for your support, and I'll see you all again next week.